A crisp autumn breeze rustled through the small town of Crestwood as Officer Jack Reynolds adjusted his sunglasses, leaning against the hood of his patrol car. Jack prided himself on being thorough and by the book, even if his methods sometimes rubbed people the wrong way. Crestwood wasn't a place where much happened, just the occasional speeding ticket or rowdy teenager. It was a sleepy kind of town, the kind where everyone thought they knew everyone. That was why the sight of a beat-up old sedan rolling through the downtown area caught Jack's attention. The car's left taillight was cracked, and it looked like it hadn't been properly registered in years. Jack sighed, slipping into his well-practiced role as the town's enforcer of order. He flipped on his lights, pulled behind the vehicle, and signaled for the driver to pull over. As the car eased to a stop by the curb, Jack grabbed his ticket book, stepped out, and approached the driver's window. He caught a glimpse of the woman behind the wheel, an older black woman with neatly styled silver hair and a calm demeanor that seemed to say she wasn't in much of a hurry. Jack didn't recognize her, which was odd for Crestwood. Most of the townsfolk had been here for decades, their faces etched into Jack's memory like landmarks. License and registration, Jack said, his tone clipped but professional. He didn't mean to come off as harsh, it was just habit. The woman turned her head slowly, giving him a look that Jack couldn't quite read. Was it annoyance? Amusement? She rummaged in her oversized purse and pulled out her license, handing it over with steady hands. "Good afternoon, officer," she said, her voice smooth and polite. Her tone carried a subtle authority that made Jack hesitate for a moment before taking the card. "Afternoon," Jack replied, his eyes scanning her license. The name Margaret Hayes stared back at him. The name didn't ring any bells. "You a visitor here?" he asked, flipping the card back toward her as he began jotting down details. "You could say that," Margaret replied with a small smile. "Just moved in, actually." Jack frowned slightly. A newcomer to Crestwood was rare, especially someone like Margaret, who seemed polished, like she belonged in a bustling city rather than their quiet little town. "Well, your registration's expired," he said, gesturing toward the dashboard. "I'll need to write you up for that." He waited for a flash of irritation, maybe even an argument. Instead, Margaret leaned back in her seat, hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, and nodded. "I figured that might be the case," she said. "Take your time." Jack wasn't sure how to feel about her calmness. Most people had a spark of defensiveness when faced with a ticket. He scribbled quickly on his notepad, eager to wrap this up. Just as he handed her the slip, his radio crackled to life. "Officer Reynolds," came the dispatcher's voice, sharp and urgent. "Report to the precinct immediately, priority 1. Jack's brow furrowed as he glanced back toward his car. "Copy that," he said into his shoulder mic. Then, turning back to Margaret, he added, "You'll need to take care of this as soon as possible. Drive safely." Margaret nodded, took the ticket without a word, and drove off with the same measured calmness she had when he first stopped her. Jack watched her go, unease prickling at the back of his neck. There was something about her composure that didn't sit right. When Jack arrived at the station, it was buzzing with unusual energy. Officers were huddled in small groups, their conversations punctuated by nervous laughter and murmurs of disbelief. Jack walked in, scanning the room for the source of the commotion. "What's going on?" he asked his partner, Chris, who was standing by the coffee machine, looking more jittery than usual. Chris chuckled nervously. "Oh man, you're not gonna believe this. We got a new chief of police. They're already here, some kind of bigwig from the city. Total surprise hire." Jack felt his stomach drop. He hadn't heard anything about a leadership change, and the thought of answering to someone from outside their tight-knit community didn't sit well. Crestwood didn't need big city ideas messing with their small-town ways. "Where are they?" Jack asked, trying to mask his apprehension. "Conference room," Chris said, jerking his thumb toward the back of the station. "You better get in there. Looks like they're meeting with everyone today." Jack squared his shoulders and made his way down the hallway. The door to the conference room was slightly ajar, and through the crack he could hear a familiar voice, smooth, authoritative, and unmistakable. His heart skipped a beat as he pushed the door open. Sitting at the head of the table, dressed in a crisp navy suit with a badge gleaming on the lapel, was Margaret Hayes. The same woman he had just ticketed not 20 minutes ago. She looked up as he entered, her eyes locking onto his with a faint smile that now carried a hint of amusement. "Ah, Officer Reynolds," she said, her tone warm but firm. "I was hoping we'd get a chance to chat. Please, take a seat." Jack froze, the weight of the situation hitting him like a freight train. His mind raced, searching for a way to salvage what was quickly spiraling into a career-defining moment. And as Margaret's gaze held his, steady and unyielding, Jack realized one thing with gut-churning clarity. This was no ordinary new hire. This was his new boss. Jack felt a lump form in his throat as he reluctantly stepped further into the room. Margaret Hayes hadn't taken her eyes off him, her calm expression somehow both unnerving and commanding. The other officers seated around the table shifted awkwardly, a few of them exchanging glances. Jack couldn't help but feel like he was the punchline to a joke he didn't understand yet. Margaret gestured to an empty chair. "Please, Officer Reynolds, join us." Jack sat, his mind racing. He couldn't decide whether to speak up about their earlier encounter or stay quiet. What were the odds of something like this happening? And why hadn't anyone mentioned a new chief was coming in? The old chief, Frank Davidson, had been with the department for years. He wasn't exactly progressive, but he was predictable, which suited Jack just fine. Margaret placed her hands neatly on the table, her gaze sweeping the room. "Thank you all for being here. I know this is sudden, and transitions like this can be unsettling. Chief Davidson's early retirement was unexpected, but I hope to bring fresh energy and focus to the department." Her voice was steady, professional, but there was an undertone of warmth that hinted at a deeper sincerity. Jack hated to admit it, but she was good, polished, confident, everything a leader should be. It only made him feel worse about the ticket. "I'll start by saying this. I believe in accountability and community. A police department should serve its people, not the other way around," she continued. "I've spent the last 2 decades working in some of the toughest urban areas, and if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: respect is earned, not demanded." Jack's jaw tightened. Respect. That word lingered in his mind, dredging up the memory of her calm, measured voice as she accepted the ticket without a flicker of irritation. Now, sitting here, she didn't look like someone who let things slide. He wondered if she had already recognized him, or if it was just a coincidence that her eyes seemed to linger on him a little longer than anyone else. "Before we dive into details," Margaret said, pulling Jack out of his thoughts, "I'd like to hear from all of you. What do you think is working here, and what do you think needs to change? This is your department too. I want us to build something we're all proud of." The room was silent at first. A few officers glanced at each other, uncertain who should speak up. Finally, Chris cleared his throat, always the first to break the ice. Chief Hayes, welcome to Crestwood. I think I speak for everyone when I say we're excited to have you here." Jack internally cringed at Chris' overly eager tone, but Margaret smiled graciously. "Thank you, officer." "Chris Monroe," he said quickly, "been with the department for 8 years. Margaret nodded, her attention unwavering. "And what do you think, Officer Monroe? What's Crestwood's greatest strength as a community?" Chris hesitated, clearly not expecting such a direct question. "Well, it's a tight-knit town. People look out for each other. It's quiet, you know." Margaret's smile widened slightly. "Quiet can be good, but quiet doesn't mean perfect, does it?" Chris shifted in his seat, his confidence faltering. Jack watched as Margaret expertly guided the conversation, drawing out input from officers who rarely spoke in meetings. She had a way of making people feel both comfortable and scrutinized at the same time, and it was starting to put Jack on edge. The tension in the room grew as she continued probing, asking pointed questions about procedures, relationships with the community, and handling complaints. Finally, she turned her attention to Jack. "Officer Reynolds." His heart skipped a beat. "Yes, Chief." "You've been quiet. I'd like to hear your thoughts. What's one thing you think this department does exceptionally well?" Jack straightened in his chair, choosing his words carefully. "We know the community," he said. "Crestwood's small enough that we're familiar with most of the people here. It helps us respond faster and usually keep things from escalating." "Usually?" Margaret asked, tilting her head slightly. Her expression was unreadable, but Jack couldn't shake the feeling she was testing him. "Well," he said, feeling the weight of everyone's eyes on him, "no system is perfect. There's always room for improvement." Margaret nodded slowly, as if weighing his words. "Fair enough," she said. "Improvement is why I'm here. Let's work on that together." The meeting wrapped up soon after, but the unease Jack felt lingered. As the officers filed out of the room, Margaret caught his eye. "Officer Reynolds, a moment." Jack froze mid-step. He glanced at Chris, who gave him a sympathetic shrug before heading out. Taking a deep breath, Jack turned back toward Margaret, who was now standing by the window, looking out over the town square. "Close the door, please," she said without looking at him. Jack complied, his palms beginning to sweat. This was it. She must have remembered the traffic stop. Maybe she thought he'd overstepped, or worse, embarrassed her. He braced himself as he approached, determined to explain himself if necessary. Margaret finally turned, her gaze steady but not unkind. I wanted to address something directly, she began. I believe in transparency and I don't like leaving things unspoken. Jack nodded, his throat too dry to respond. This morning, she said, her voice calm but firm, you pulled me over. There it was. Jack opened his mouth to respond, but she held up a hand. I'm not upset, she continued. In fact, I appreciated how professional you were. But I do have one question for you. Jack swallowed hard. Yes, Chief. Why do you think I didn't mention who I was? The question caught him off guard. He hadn't considered it before now. Most people in her position would have played the "do you know who I am" card immediately, but she hadn't. Instead, she'd accepted the ticket like any other citizen. I don't know, Jack admitted. Margaret folded her arms, her expression softening slightly. Because respect, Officer Reynolds, isn't about rank or titles. It's about actions. And I wanted to see how you treat someone who, to you, was just another face on the street. Jack felt a mix of relief and discomfort. He hadn't done anything wrong per se, but the fact that she'd been testing him without his knowledge made him uneasy. I hope you don't mind me saying this, Margaret added, but I see potential in you. I also see someone who's set in his ways. Change is coming, Officer Reynolds, whether we're ready for it or not. The question is, will you rise to meet it? Jack didn't know how to respond. He felt like a spotlight had been turned on him, exposing every flaw he didn't even know he had. All he could do was nod. Margaret gave him a small smile, the kind that felt more like a challenge than reassurance. Good, I'll see you tomorrow. Jack left the room, his mind a whirlwind of thoughts. Margaret Hayes wasn't just a boss. She was something else entirely, a force of nature. And if Jack had learned anything in their brief interactions, it was this. Crestwood was about to change in ways none of them could have anticipated. The next morning, Jack arrived at the station earlier than usual, but he wasn't alone. Margaret was already there, sitting at her desk in the glass-walled office that now bore her nameplate. She was going through a stack of files, her expression focused, a steaming mug of coffee beside her. Jack paused for a moment, watching her through the glass. She didn't seem like someone who ever stopped working. That was probably why she'd risen so far in her career, but it also made her an enigma. Jack couldn't figure out her angle. The rest of the station slowly came to life as officers filtered in, exchanging greetings and grabbing coffee. Chris sidled up to Jack, a grin already plastered on his face. Man, what did the chief want with you yesterday? Chris asked, lowering his voice. She lay into you about the ticket thing. Not exactly, Jack replied, keeping his tone neutral. She said she wasn't upset. Chris raised an eyebrow. Not upset. That's a miracle. You know she's got a reputation, right? Big city, big reforms, not afraid to shake things up. Jack frowned. What kind of reforms? The kind that usually means more paperwork for us, Chris said with a laugh. But seriously, I heard she cleaned house in her last apartment. Fired half the staff, said they weren't up to her standards. Jack's stomach twisted. He didn't like the sound of that. Crestwood was a small town. That department ran on trust and familiarity. If Margaret started making drastic changes, it could throw everything out of balance. Jack spent most of the morning out on patrol, but the usual quiet of the town did little to calm his nerves. Margaret's words from the day before kept replaying in his mind. Will you rise to meet it? What did she expect from him, exactly? And what was she planning to do with the department? The questions gnawed at him, leaving him on edge. By lunchtime, he found himself parked outside one of Crestwood's diners, sipping lukewarm coffee from a thermos. He was flipping through his notepad when a familiar voice startled him. Mind if I join you? Jack looked up to see Margaret standing by his window, her coat buttoned against the crisp autumn air. Before he could answer, she opened the passenger door and slid in, her own coffee in hand. You're out here working hard, I see, she said, her tone light but with that same undercurrent of authority. Jack cleared his throat. Just taking a break. Something I can help you with, Chief? Call me Margaret, she said, smiling slightly. And no, nothing official. I just wanted to talk. Jack wasn't sure whether to feel flattered or nervous. He nodded, unsure what to say. Margaret leaned back in the seat, her eyes scanning the quiet street outside. I've been reading through the department's records, she said after a moment. It's clear you care about this town. You've been here, what, 10 years? 11, Jack corrected. Born and raised here. Most people in Crestwood are. Margaret nodded, her expression thoughtful. That's part of what makes small towns like this special, but it also makes them resistant to change. Jack felt his defenses go up. Sometimes change isn't what people want. True, Margaret said, turning to face him, but sometimes it's exactly what they need. Her words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Jack set his coffee down, his jaw tightening. Look, with all due respect, things in Crestwood work fine the way they are. We don't have big city problems here. We don't need big city solutions. Margaret's smile didn't waver, but there was something steely in her gaze. I'm not here to impose. I'm here to listen. But what I've seen so far tells me there's room for improvement. Jack opened his mouth to argue but stopped himself. She wasn't wrong. There were things the department could do better. He knew that. But admitting it felt like betraying the town he loved. He glanced at her, trying to gauge her intentions, but Margaret was impossible to read. Before he could respond, Margaret's radio crackled to life. The dispatcher's voice came through, tense and urgent. Units respond to a disturbance at Crestwood Bank. Possible armed robbery in progress. Margaret's expression changed instantly, a calm demeanor replaced by sharp focus. She grabbed the radio from her coat. This is Chief Hayes. I'm en route. Jack reached for his own radio. Officer Reynolds responding as well. Margaret shot him a glance, her eyes alight with determination. Let's go. The drive to the bank was tense, the air in Jack's patrol car thick with unspoken urgency. Margaret didn't say a word, a gaze fixed ahead. Jack couldn't help but notice how calm she seemed, even as the situation escalated. He, on the other hand, felt the familiar rush of adrenaline, his grip tightening on the wheel. When they arrived, the scene was already chaotic. Civilians were gathered at a safe distance, murmuring anxiously as officers tried to establish a perimeter. Through the glass doors of the bank, Jack could make out at least 2 figures inside, both wearing masks and brandishing weapons. Margaret stepped out of the car, her presence commanding immediate attention. She spoke to the nearest officer, assessing the situation with rapid precision. Jack followed her lead, his nerves buzzing. "What's the situation?" Margaret asked. 2 suspects armed, the officer replied. They got hostages, about 5, maybe 6. Margaret nodded, her mind clearly working through a plan. She turned to Jack. You ever handled a hostage situation before? Jack hesitated. Not like this. Good, Margaret said, her tone firm. Then you'll follow my lead. Jack bristled at the implication but didn't argue. This wasn't the time for pride. He watched as Margaret moved toward the negotiator, her calm authority cutting through the chaos like a blade. Over the next hour, Margaret orchestrated the response with remarkable precision, her experience shining through. She negotiated with the suspects, keeping them talking while the SWAT team moved into position. Jack found himself impressed despite his reservations. Margaret wasn't just good, she was exceptional. When the hostages were finally freed and the suspects apprehended, the tension in the air dissolved into a mixture of relief and exhaustion. Margaret stood at the center of it all, her presence steady and unshaken. As the officers began wrapping up the scene, Margaret turned to Jack, a faint smile playing on her lips. Not bad for our first day in the field together, huh? Jack didn't know what to say. For the first time, he saw Margaret not as a threat to the town's way of life, but as someone who might actually make a difference. But that didn't mean he was ready to trust her. Not yet. Margaret seemed to sense his hesitation. She stepped closer, her voice low enough that only he could hear. I know you're not sure about me, Officer Reynolds. And that's okay. Trust takes time. But I meant what I said. I see potential in you. Don't waste it. Jack watched her walk away, the weight of her words settling over him. Potential, change, trust. They were just words, but somehow, coming from Margaret, they felt like promises, and maybe even threats. One thing was certain. This was only the beginning. The next few weeks brought a whirlwind of changes to the Crestwood Police Department. Margaret's presence was felt in every corner of the station. Policies were updated, new training sessions were scheduled, and the old, comfortable routines that Jack and his colleagues had relied on for years were upended. Margaret's standards were clear: efficiency, transparency, and above all, accountability. For Jack, the adjustments felt like a constant battle. He wasn't opposed to the idea of improvement, but the pace at which Margaret pushed for change was overwhelming. Every day seemed to bring a new challenge, and Jack could feel the weight of her expectations pressing down on him. The rest of the team wasn't faring much better. Chris, usually the easygoing optimist, had started grumbling about the extra workload. Other officers whispered in corners, speculating about how long Margaret would last before the town's slow pace drove her back to the city. But Margaret remained undeterred, her focus razor-sharp. Jack found himself spending more time on patrol, using the quiet streets as an escape from the constant buzz of the station. But even out here, Margaret's influence was unavoidable. One afternoon, as he drove past the old community center, he noticed a group of teenagers hanging out by the graffiti-covered walls. Normally, he would have let it slide. They weren't causing trouble, just loitering. But Margaret's voice echoed in his mind. Engage with the community. Build trust. He sighed, pulling over. The teens glanced up warily as he approached, their conversation falling silent. Jack wasn't sure what to say. He wasn't used to striking up casual conversations in situations like this. "Hey," he said, trying to sound approachable. "What are you all up to?" One of the boys, taller than the rest and wearing a worn hoodie, shrugged. "Nothing, man, just talking." Jack nodded, his eyes scanning the group. "You know, this building used to host basketball games. You guys play?" A few of them exchanged glances. The taller boy crossed his arms. "Yeah, sometimes." Jack pointed to the faded lines of the court painted on the cracked asphalt. "That hoop's still standing. Why don't you use it?" "It's busted," another boy muttered. "No net, and the rim's bent." Jack paused, considering his options. He knew Margaret would push him to do more than just walk away. "Tell you what," he said finally. "I'll talk to the department about getting that fixed, but you've got to promise me something." "What?" the tall boy asked, his tone skeptical. "Promise me you'll actually use it," Jack said. "No more hanging around out here. Deal?" The boys hesitated, but eventually the tall one nodded. "Deal." As Jack returned to his car, he couldn't shake the feeling that Margaret's approach might be working after all, even if it didn't come naturally to him. But the thought was fleeting. As he pulled back onto the main road, his radio crackled. "Officer Reynolds, report to the precinct. Priority 1. Jack's stomach tightened. He acknowledged the call and sped toward the station, his mind racing. Priority calls were rare in Crestwood, and they usually meant something serious. When he arrived, the atmosphere in the station was tense. Officers were clustered around Margaret's office, their expressions grim. "What's going on?" Jack asked Chris, who was pacing near the coffee machine. Chris looked up, his face pale. "It's bad. The bank suspects. They've got connections to a larger gang. Looks like Crestwood wasn't just a random target." Jack frowned, his pulse quickening. "What kind of connections?" "Drugs, weapons trafficking," Chris said. "Margaret's been digging into it. She thinks they've got more operations in the area, maybe even help from someone local." Jack's stomach dropped. Crestwood wasn't supposed to be the kind of place where organized crime could take root. It was supposed to be safe, predictable. The thought of a larger criminal presence in town was almost too much to process. Margaret emerged from her office, her expression as serious as Jack had ever seen it. "Listen up," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "We got intel suggesting the gang behind the bank robbery is planning another move, and this time it's bigger. We don't know exactly what they're targeting yet, but we know it's happening soon." Jack stepped forward. "Do we have any leads?" Margaret nodded. "We've identified a property on the outskirts of town. A warehouse. It's been off the radar for years, but surveillance suggests it's active now. We'll need to move quickly." The room buzzed with nervous energy as Margaret laid out the plan. Officers would surround the warehouse under the cover of darkness, cutting off any escape routes. SWAT would handle the breach, but local officers like Jack were tasked with securing the perimeter and providing backup. As the briefing ended, Jack felt a knot of unease in his chest. Something about the situation didn't feel right. Crestwood wasn't equipped for operations like this. They were a small-town department, not a tactical unit. And yet, Margaret spoke with such confidence that it was hard not to believe in her plan. That night, as Jack took his position near the warehouse, the tension in the air was palpable. The surrounding woods were eerily silent, the faint hum of distant traffic the only sound. Jack scanned the area with his flashlight, his hand resting on the holster of his sidearm. Minutes felt like hours as the operation unfolded. Margaret's voice came through the radio, calm and precise, directing the teams into position. Jack could hear the faint rustle of movement as officers crept closer to the building. Then, a sound shattered the stillness, a loud crash, followed by shouts and the unmistakable crack of gunfire. Jack's heart pounded as he gripped his weapon, his training kicking in. He stayed low, moving toward the commotion. Through the trees, he could see the warehouse illuminated by the harsh glare of spotlights, shadows darting across its walls. Shots fired. Margaret's voice rang out over the radio. "All units, hold your positions and secure the perimeter." Jack's pulse raced as he scanned the area for any signs of movement. He could hear the killers inside the warehouse, shouting, the pounding of footsteps, more gunfire. But something in the shadows caught his attention. A figure slipping out of a side door, moving quickly toward the tree line. "Chief, we got someone heading north," Jack reported into his radio. "Engage, but proceed with caution," Margaret replied. Jack moved quickly, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The figure ahead was fast, darting through the trees with practiced ease. Jack pushed himself to keep up, his breathing ragged as he closed the distance. "Stop," he shouted, his voice echoing through the woods. "Police." The figure didn't stop. Instead, they veered sharply to the left, disappearing behind a cluster of bushes. Jack followed, his grip tightening on his weapon. When he rounded the corner, he found himself face to face with a man in his early 30s, sweat glistening on his forehead. The man froze, his hands hovering near his waistband. "Don't move," Jack commanded, his voice firm. For a moment, the man hesitated, his eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. Jack's finger hovered over the trigger, every muscle in his body coiled with tension. And then from behind him, he heard Margaret's voice, low and steady. "Easy, Jack. I've got you covered." Jack didn't look back, but the presence of her voice steadied him. The man slowly raised his hands, his expression shifting from defiance to resignation. Jack moved in, cuffing him as Margaret approached. As they secured the suspect and prepared to bring him back to the station, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the tip of the iceberg. Margaret's earlier words echoed in his mind. "Change is coming. Will you rise to meet it?" For the first time, Jack wondered if he was ready for the answer.